Okay, so this project is looking at, this is a project that was sponsored by Hort Innovations, and my partner in crime has been Cecil. People may know them, a soil science laboratory, and Declan's not here today, but I'll go through what we did. So it's a 3-year project looking at how farmers can benefit from boosting earthworm numbers in their farm. So in a way it's an extension on work that's been done over the last few years around soil health, and it's really looking at, well, once you start getting a healthy population of earthworms, what can that do for productivity? And there hasn't been a whole lot of work, I'd say almost no work done around the benefits of earthworms in vegetable production. There was work done in pasture and other cropping systems back in the 70s and 80s, but with the exception of a few PhDs here and there over the last couple of decades, there's been nothing done. So you'll leave this room being Australia's experts on earthworms, and I have that from a retired CSIRO scientist who said there's no one in Australia now who knows about them. So there'll be a short test at the end. And look, I do apologise, there won't be a test. I do apologise, it is a bit of a lecture, but we'll get through it. So firstly, I'm going to talk a bit about earthworms. Just there is a huge variety. I came into this, my background is agricultural science, but I mainly work in the area of organic waste recovery, turning into compost. So most of my work around soil health has been to do with the use of compost. I'm not a vegetable farmer. I've worked in dryland agriculture in the past. But I went in thinking earthworms, just, there's not many different varieties. There's a huge variety. It's a bit like describing fish as a single type of thing. The diversity of earthworms is similar to that, and it's not a bad analogy. They are swimming through the soil. Then I'll talk about what you can do within your farming system to build up a useful population of earthworms, and talk about the main research that we did. So I've got a Charles Darwin quote there, I won't read it, but he did a lot of work around earthworms. He was quite obsessed with earthworms. But really there's this virtuous cycle that earthworms are the farmers of the soil. They're in there. I'll get all these up. So basically you've got this cycle where healthy plants result in good organic matter, you get good soil biota, you get healthy earthworms, they do work, they make the plants healthier. So they're constantly working, creating an environment that's good for earthworms basically, but it's also good for plants and productivity. Yeah, and as I say, the cycle goes round, and also the healthy root growth feeds the soil biota and the earthworms. And just in case people zone out, I thought I'd get to my key points now in terms of the spoilers. So I jumped to the chase. So really, the conclusions are, so we did a literature review and then field research, but they can help to restore soil and reduce the need for tillage and fertiliser. But what you need to do that is get your organic carbon levels up, and particularly your labile carbon. So the trials we did, we found that compost, which is a more stable form of carbon, didn't have as much benefit as green manure crops. And I guess you've got the benefit of the cover crop and the green manure, but it sort of makes sense. The earthworms live mainly on bacteria and fungi they eat. So anything that feeds bacteria and fungi in the soil will feed the earthworms. They will eat organic material as well, but mainly their food is other organisms in the soil. Reduced tillage. This is bad news for a lot of veggie farming. The idea that you chop a worm in half and the two halves crawl off and turn into a new worm is a myth. We did find a couple, very few. We found a few earthworms that were regenerating a tail, but that would have only been one half the worm. But rotary hoes are basically earthworm blenders. So whatever depth you go to, you will kill pretty much every earthworm in that zone. Moisture management. They're hardy beasts. They are remarkably resilient, but if they have more than 3 months of dry conditions, their numbers will start falling off. They go down, when things dry out, they go down the profile, form a little cocoon sort of in the soil, and can live there for 3 months or more, but their numbers will drop off, and their egg numbers will drop off if things are drier for longer than that. Which I guess, for irrigated veggie farmers, you've got the advantage that you can manage that. And chemical management, and I'll talk a bit about that. Some people are pretty black and white, and there's a lot of emotion in this, but really review of the literature and certainly our experience in the field is if other conditions are right, they go okay. There's some chemicals that are harsher than others, and when pot tests are done, they show up as very toxic. But out in the field, if you've got the conditions right, the earthworms populations tend to survive and thrive. Okay. So in terms of what earthworms can do, and basically when they're active, an adult earthworm can eat and excrete its body weight a day. So if you get a healthy population, which looking at the literature, looking at work done, sort of around 200 earthworms per square metre, can turn over 2 tonnes of soil per hectare and fertilise it on the way and put growth stimulants into it as well. They excrete growth stimulants. And obviously the higher population you are, the more work they'll do. And really what we're looking at is, can you get to the point where you have to do less subsurface tillage because you've got a healthy earthworm population doing that work for you? And it's a challenge on a lot of veggie farms, but we did find farmers who are doing that. In terms of what you'll see in a soil that's affected, I think I've got a light here. So you really see a lot of aeration in the soil. You will see roots going down burrows quite often. Here's another one showing the effect. And you really see the little peds. This is their casts, their excretion. And you see that in the soil. And they excrete, they also, as they move through the soil, excrete calcium carbonate. That's their sort of lubricant for moving through the soil. So they're in there adding things to the soil and working the soil and aerating the soil in a way that just improves the soil. It's making the same point again, that when you find an earthworm-rich soil, you really can see it. You can just, the moment you dig it up, you can say, okay, they're active here, and you can see that it's all fluffed up and aerated. Okay, in terms of what they want, organic matter is the main thing. As I say, they eat soil bacteria and fungi, so they want healthy populations of that. So if you are using farm chemicals that knock around your fungi and your bacteria, you're going to have a feed chain effect on the earthworm. They get a positive response to nitrogen, and again that's probably to do with the feeding of the soil biota and feeding of the roots and things that again feed the soil biota and give them food. Moisture, and as I say, with veggie farmers it's not as critical. There was one farm that we didn't include in our study because they're in a low rainfall zone, but since then they have great earthworm numbers, and obviously they can irrigate and maintain the populations. pH, they're pretty hardy on pH, so that's what the literature says, but I found them in soils that are more acidic than that, seem to be doing okay. Just really anything that disturbs the soil is going to disturb the earthworms. The types of earthworms, so the ones that most people might be familiar with if they've ever had a worm farm are the compost worms, and these are worms that live up in the leaf litter pretty much, and in pasture you'll find them. They don't do a lot of work down the soil profile. They're more prolific, they'll breed rapidly, but you can't introduce them. If you introduce them into a cropping system, so if you went out and bought the sort of compost worms that you can buy around and tried to introduce them into your paddock, they wouldn't take, because they live up on the surface, feeding on organic material. They're not going to be doing the work. The ones that do the work for us are these middle dwelling ones, so the endogeeic ones, and they have lots of burrows, semi-permanent burrows all through the sort of upper, here it's only to 20 centimetres, you're really down to here. If your soil's deep enough, they'll be down there. And then you get deep dwelling ones, and again, we had a few farmers who said, when we dig trenches we find these huge worms further down. They're usually found in pastures, and they feed down deeply. They come to the surface to feed and go back down. Again, not doing a bit of work in terms of water infiltration down the soil profile and taking nutrient down the profile, but really not common. We didn't find a lot of evidence among the farms we were on, and I think it's again this largely bare surface on a lot of farms, not much food for them, and also exposure, I think, to more exposure to farm chemicals than our agronomic earthworms here. So, diversity. Over 700 species of earthworms in Australia are native and introduced. And what we looked for were whether they were native and introduced. And we actually found, and this has been found through the research that has been done in Australia, 700 different species of earthworms. There's about 5 introduced species that you'll find on any farm system, whether anything that's had improved pasture, anything that's had tillage and chemical use. Basically, you end up with these 5 or 6 very hardy types of earthworms that are, I guess, evolved or been selected for in farming systems. So we thought we were going to have a lot of difficulty identifying earthworms, but we got, we had an ID guide, and after a while we were able to pull up and say, oh, yep, that's a grey, that's a purple. It was very easy to do the taxonomy on most of them. But we divided them into mature, juvenile, and hatchlings, just to get an idea of the population. So if we found that there were a lot of juveniles and hatchlings, but not many adults, that told you that there were disturbances happening in the farm system. There were basically, you weren't getting the old earthworms, because earthworms can live for years if the conditions are right. Okay, one thing that again learnt through the project is earthworms are really slow. The ones that do the work have a really long life cycle. They're not prolific. They're not like your compost earthworms that breed very rapidly. That's a hatchling coming out of an egg there. So they take a long time to mature. Then they have to find each other. If you've got low populations, that can be a challenge for them. They're hermaphrodites, so once they do meet, they both go away fertilised, and then they'll lay eggs sort of 1 a week for a very extended period. They'll keep laying. They lay quite a big egg. You can see it there, so a fairly big egg. My previous work with sort of things that produce those were cereal cyst nematode, and they'll have 20 to 40 nematodes in there. Here you'll get 1 to 2 at most. So they do a lot of work to produce not very many. Then the cycle goes around again. So the real point is, if you do anything that wipes out your earthworm numbers, you're probably looking at 12 months or so until they recover. They're not like your compost worms that can come back in 2 weeks or so. So fumigation, whether that's biofumigation or chemical fumigation or thermal fumigation, is going to knock them about, and heavy tillage will knock them about. They're the main things that will take them out. In terms of their hibernation, sorry it's a bit out of focus, but they go very red or pink, tie themselves in a knot, I don't know why they do that, and form a little cell. This is one of their little cells, so they sort of line it in mucus and it stays moist enough, and they're hardy. I had some, don't tell the RSPCA, I took some samples home and forgot about them and got back to them about 4 months later, and the soil was quite dry in the containers. They're still alive, so they're tough. Okay, so probably covered a lot of these points in terms of what they need and what they do. So I'll get into the research. One key point is, worms are not, they're related, but they're not nematodes. They don't attack plants. We had some farmers saying, won't they attack the roots of plants? But they don't. They only eat, mainly they eat bacteria and fungi and a bit of organic material that might be around them, but dead organic material. Yeah, I think I've covered most of those points. Okay, so our research outcomes. So we spent a lot of time out in paddocks digging a measured sized hole and getting the samples out of that to see how many are around. So we were really looking, I guess, as I say, there've been pretty much no work done in Australia or pretty much anywhere about earthworms in vegetable production. So we were looking at, well, what diversity is out there. As I say, we found out it's just this handful of very hardy earthworms that are right across Australia. We found a couple that might be native species or species we can identify when there was a pasture phase, but otherwise they were those ones. We had 2 main research sites, one down in Moriarty in Tassie and the other in Maffra, Victoria, and 16 other sites around the country. And they were observation sites. So we did 2 years on these sites and 3 years on this site in terms of data collection. We did there was a bit of, I guess the farmers who were willing to work with us had an interest in soil health, and a lot of them were already most of them were doing work around improving organic matter. And I think, that's probably in hindsight, a lesson would be better to find a farmer who's got more conventional practice and very low soil carbon and try the systems there. But it was useful in terms of finding, well, if you are managing your soil well, what can you expect and what are the other variables affecting earthworm numbers? And there was a whole range of practices on the farms. So they're the sites that we went to and the data we collected. Okay. There are a lot of variables across sites. The nature of this work, it's very hard to control the variables, and that sort of had a bit of impact on the data. So a lot of we got some quite good sort of quantitative data, but a lot of the data we got was qualitative, particularly talking to the growers about, well, would this work in your system? Why don't you do that? That sort of information. So there's quite a lot of variation. Sometimes we got onto sites that hadn't been disturbed for 3 or 4 months, and other sites we went in and they've fairly recently been a crop put in, and obviously there'd been that tillage, there'd been a drying of the soil quite often associated with that, and that impacted on earthworm numbers. So we tried, in those situations though we had set areas we were looking on the farms, we tried to go and look in other areas just to say, well, what are earthworm numbers like at this time to compare with our trial areas. We did get some, I think any field trial work, if anyone's done it, you do get odd results. There was one farm in particular, just perfect soil management, perfect conditions, not a single earthworm. You could see burrows, you could see the soil was affected. No idea. I spent hours out there just looking and looking and looking, and none. I had a lot of the. Are there any vermiculture, like worm farm people in the room? No, good. They're a weird mob. This guy said to me when I told him. when I told him this, he said, "Oh, what was the phase of the moon?" Anyway, I'll leave that. We didn't look into that variable. Okay, we had our main research sites. We had we had randomised block design, so they're the layout. So we had 3 bays, and then the treatments which were randomly selected where they were. And I put this up because there was some variability in the bays on one of the sites, just with their irrigation, the distribution of irrigation was different, and that impacted on results. Our different treatments, so we looked at compost application, worm casts, and this was really looking at, one, if you had a soil that didn't have a good earthworm population, what would the effect of worm casts be on it, but also just to test vermiculture products to see what effect that had. Biofumigation in there to see the impact that had, green manure, so a cover crop and then integration, and the control, which was pretty much the standard rotation. And as I say, we worked with farmers who already had good practices, so our control, in a way, was almost a green manure treatment at times, which again impacted on results. And the treatments were reapplied each year. So there's the Maffra site. So it's a leafy green, very, quite intensive production. It was dairy country up to about 10 years ago, and from day one it's been managed with good practice around traffic management, cover crops, green manures, sensitive chemical use, all the things that you would try to do if you're trying to work with earthworms, and it is one of our best sites for earthworm numbers. Just what I said. The results, so here we had, in the very first year, so before we did the treatments, the site had been biofumigated and earthworm numbers were really down. So this is the worm counts per hole, and the holes were 300 millimetres by 300 millimetres by 300 millimetres, basically. Sometimes we went a bit deeper. That was the standard sample. And then the treatments. And I'm showing this to show some of the variability we got in Bay 3. If you have a look here, and it happened both years that we got these low results, which if you've ever done statistics, you just need results like this to suddenly get statistically not very powerful results. But otherwise, we on the other repetitions, we actually saw quite stark differences in some of the treatments. So again, here's the averages. So again, starting from a low, fairly even base, the green manure, sorry if that's a bit fuzzy to read, but this is the green manure, this is compost, biofumigation, worm cast and the control. So we were able to show a significant difference with the green manure, and the compost almost showed up. If it hadn't been for those dud results, we would have had it for sure. That's again the results just showing how the population changed. And you can see the green manure, obviously is performing better than the other. Probably unsurprisingly, we test. The soil analysis looked at correlations between earthworm activity and different variables, and we found oxidisable carbon, so the more labile stuff, was a very strong indicator of what was going to be happening with earthworms. And there's the soil again. I've had that picture up already, but you really, the moment you dug in here, you could just feel this soil was being worked by earthworms. Moriarty, so this is the second. This is a photo of it in the second year, where the whole thing went under a broad bean crop, which again, it's like a green manure right through the crop. So it's an onion and carrot grower with potatoes, and for the last 10 years or so, it's pretty standard to build in basically a green manure into the rotation. One thing with this site, clay loam, but there was variability across the site in terms of the depth of this gravelly clay, and that had an impact on sites because tillage, obviously, if you're doing tillage down to 250, and that's where the gravelly clay is, a lot of the earthworms are going to be up in the better soil when you till. If you till to 250 and there's 400 millimetres of depth, you've got a zone in which the earthworms can survive, so we did get variability across the site. I won't dwell on that too much, other than to say that I think because of soil management, all the control often, which is here, had good earthworm numbers. And it was in the last year where things had been disturbed fairly recently and was drying that you saw some of the differences with some of the treatments around. That's the green manure there. So I'll keep moving through that. But again, we found green manure was sort of the highest, then worm casts, which were all on par pretty much with compost and the control, and then biofumigation was the lowest. And again, we found this, the oxidisable, the labile carbon was a good indicator of what was going to happen. So green manure stood out, and I think you've got the effect of the feeding and the protection during the cover crop stage of it, and then obviously the big hit of labile carbon when you integrate that. As I say, because we worked on farms with good soil management for the main trials, some of the results were a bit muted there, and the timing of sampling, just when we could get on and what the conditions were like, had impact there. So comparing year to year was not as useful as just comparing within year variation. Okay, the other sites, I'll get through this fairly quickly. So a lot of this was just observation. We took data off, but a lot of it was just looking at, well, with this type of practice, what impact does it have on earthworm numbers? What we did on each of these sites, our control was we went off and found an area of land that hadn't been disturbed for a while, so that might be just an area that's not cropped, and just see what earthworm numbers would look like without more intensive farming on it. We classified the farms according to intensity of production. This is intensity of tillage, sorry, and the sort of counts we got. And look, we found there were quite a few farms where we got low counts regardless. So I think, it could be that conditions were drying. In hindsight, I think that's probably a factor, but there was a clear pattern in terms of the less intense tillage was, the more earthworms you tended to find. And that did vary. The farm at Werribee that's just got beautiful deep soil, they're quite intensive tillage, but the earthworm obviously surviving below the level of tillage and recolonising quite successfully. And this is intensity of production. This really sort of, this ends the more continual cropping, and these are, largely continual cropping, but with green manure or cover crop phases, and then going down to quite low production in terms of going out to pasture for a while between crops. Yep, thanks. And again, we got variation, and a lot of that, this was a Western Australian site, and things were drying off. So we got low results there. So in terms of the main factors, the intensity and depth of tillage had big impact around the observational sites. Biofumigation, one of the farms used biofumigation. Otherwise, fantastic soil management, and on other parts of their farm we found really good earthworm numbers, but under the area that had been biofumigated, none. Earthworms migrate, and we found this particularly if we, on an area we weren't finding many. Sometimes we go to the next bed that had different treatment, and they'd all be across there. So that they will migrate. Apparently they can migrate more than 30 metres sort of over a fairly short period of time. So they will swim through the soil and find where conditions are good. And that, I guess the significance of that is if you've got permanent irrigation lines, you can basically treat them as earthworm refuges, and they'll move back into the beds if the other conditions are right. In terms of getting them to work, really, the two main strategies are build organic matter and reduce the intensity of tillage, and some of the other factors. So drying, we had one farm that was out to pasture and things were really dry there and just no earthworms. So if things dry out solidly, that will hit your population. Chemical use, I'll talk about in a moment. And yeah, this idea of having refuges where they can come back in and potentially trying to reintroduce. So we did a bit of work around this. We didn't get black and white results, but we went to earthworm-rich areas on farms, took sods of soils and reintroduced them to areas that otherwise had good soil management, came back and tested 12 months later. You wouldn't hang your hat on our results. We're not going to publish any papers out of that, but there was some effect. Farm chemicals, and as I said earlier, there's a lot of emotion around the farm chemicals, and looking at the literature, there's a real difference between pot tests, where people do toxicity tests in pots, and in-field tests. But basically, if the other conditions are good, the earthworms, the ones that are doing the work for us, I think the ones on the surface, maybe not so great. And we did have farmers say, look, we know we've got earthworms because when we spray some insecticides, they come to the surface and die. I'm about to get gonged. Yes, so some of the certified organic products are quite toxic to earthworms, more so than some of the synthetics, which is worth knowing. And herbicides, you get a positive effect because you put all this beautiful green labile material into the soil. And fertilisers, again, you might have a short-term effect, a negative effect, but overall anything that feeds the plants, feeds the soil, feeds the earthworms. The advantages, I'm running out of time here, but just reduced input cost. Thanks. Yield gains, which we weren't able to look at in our trials, but obviously if you're bringing a soil back and making it a more sustainable soil, you're going to get a yield response there. And for most people, I think it's, a lot of people working on soil health, it really knowing that's just keeping the soil productive and healthy for them and future generations. So in terms of conclusions, and I encourage any farmers in the room to go out and just do a dig test, get out there, turn over some areas of land that haven't been disturbed for say 2 or 3 months, moisture conditions are good, get out there, just do a spadeful. You don't have to dig the bigger hole that we did, and have a look. And if you've got 2 to 4 earthworms turning up every spade, you're doing okay. You might go and test an area that's not disturbed to see what your earthworm numbers would be like without that. It might be the wrong phase of the moon, who knows. And yeah, the green manure and building labile carbons really seems to be the key to building their numbers. So just to come back to that, sort of from our work, the real keys are what they need as well as what they are doing in the soil, to reduce tillage, build organic matter and manage moisture. And I'm done.